Hello, I'm Wendy and I'm going to be painting some watercolour Christmas cards today using experimental techniques with holly as the subject. This will be the last video in my Christmas card series for the year. I'll put links to the two previous videos in the description box below. I've really enjoyed experimenting and working on the ideas I had and putting the Christmas cards together. I'll make a start by showing you the materials I used for the holly painting. You can get a full list of materials I used, together with additional tuition resources and some templates, by clicking on the link in the description box below. This is quite a long video comprising of the following demonstrations. We'll be starting off drawing the holly, then painting holly berries and looking at the colour mixing. We'll then be mixing greens for the leaves, painting the leaves and berries with the use of clingfilm. We'll be doing some splattering techniques and finally putting the cards together. Timestamps are in the description box to make it easier if you want to re-watch a particular demonstration. Drawing the holly leaves is not too tricky. I found it easier to draw an oval shape first and then to draw the leaf inside that shape, as you can see I'm doing here. Don't worry about how many spiky bits you draw, and it doesn't need to be too symmetrical. Remember to use a nice soft pencil, something like a 2B, because these pencil lines will need to be rubbed out. Draw the holly berries in now, making sure that some of them are over the leaves. I found it best not to make them too small. In actual fact, I would make them a little bit larger than I'm doing here. I think they look more effective in the finished painting. And then just draw in a few little lines to suggest where the twigs are going to be. You'll be painting those in with a brush, and it's not too critical how they're placed at the moment. You need to mask out the holly berries. I like to use a small brush, which I keep washing out in soapy water so that the masking fluid doesn't ruin it. I have made a video on how to use masking fluid in watercolour painting, and I'll put a link again in the description box. It's really important to let the masking fluid thoroughly dry before you paint over it. If you don't do that, you can pick up some of the masking fluid and it will ruin your lovely watercolour brushes. So now it's time to paint the holly berries. I think if you paint the berries with just a red, they'll look flat and uninteresting. It's always a good idea to give interest, even in small areas like this, to work at least two colours and work them wet into wet. Looking at the berries I had, I noticed orange in them and tried out a few combinations of cadmium orange and 3 of my reds. The red I'm using here is the Cotman Cadmium Red Deep. The mixers need to be pretty stiff to retain that nice bright red colour, but you do need a certain amount of water in there to maintain the fluidity and to get the wet into wet working. I then painted some more berries using, again, the Cadmium Red Deep, but this time I mixed it with a little of the alizarin crimson, trying to remember to leave that little tiny bit of the highlight. I did forget it in 1 or 2 of them. The last stage was putting that tiny black mark on them that you see on the berries, and to do this I mixed up a mixture of burnt umber with some ultramarine. So these were all the mixes that I tried out, and I decided I liked the cadmium red alizarin crimson mix the best, and that's the one that I used. I would suggest you do a lot of this sort of experimenting with colours yourselves to see what works for you. These were the colours that I used to mix the greens for the holly leaves. The yellows were cadmium yellow pale, and raw sienna, and I used mixes of these with the blue. If you haven't done so already, I really do suggest you get to know all your colours by doing swatches like I am doing now. The blue I'm using is Prussian blue. It's a favourite of mine, and if you want to know more about mixing greens, I do have a video which I will link in the description box below. Prussian blue is a very intense blue, and a little bit certainly goes a long way. I'm showing you some colour swatches now that I did using my yellows with the Prussian blue. The lemon yellow will give you the brightest, coolest green, while raw sienna will warm the mix up. Again, I suggest you do something similar to this, and you could change the blue to ultramarine or cobalt and see if you like those mixes as well. And remember to label your swatches so that you can refer back to them in future paintings. We're going to use these green mixers to paint the holly leaves, and again making them more interesting by using a variety of greens rather than just the one. I knew I would need a very dark green in places on the holly leaves, and I usually mix burnt sienna with the Prussian blue for a dark green, but when I was experimenting here I discovered that cadmium orange did a really good job also. I spent a bit of time just making colour swatches using different mixes of the two colours. Just look at the different greens that I've got just from those two colours. That's the cadmium orange and the Prussian blue. Even though you'll need to adjust them, it's always best in watercolour painting, as in other media, to get some of your mixes ready before you start your painting. This is especially important when you're working quickly, wet into wet, as you will see. I started off making an initial mix of two medium toned greens and a dark green as well, but during the painting process I made adjustments all the time by adding extra water and also some additional colour. I think it's important to show you the mixing process, especially if you're a beginner to watercolour. I've found when teaching people that a lot of people do tend not to mix up enough colour, and they don't make their darks as strong as they should. I hope this is helping with your mixing. I'd also suggest using something like these little deep circular palettes I have here, if you need to mix a quantity of paint. I find it evaporates quite quickly in the larger shallow mixing areas. So there we are, we're just about ready to start painting some of these holly leaves. I have a couple of extra things I've got ready here, and as you can see I have some cling film ready, and I also have a very dilute mix of the Prussian blue in one of the little round palettes. Now what I'm going to do is drop colour into the leaves. I don't want it to mix too much, and I want to keep everything very wet. Now with the leaves nice and wet, I painted some of the very dilute blue into the background around them, and then, goodness me, shock horror, I let it run into the leaves in places. My aim for this holly painting was not to do anything too generic and representational. I wanted more of an abstracty look, and for this you really do have to take a few chances. Every painting you do is going to be different depending on the colours that you put onto the leaves, and how wet the paint was and how much it ran, and also the effects of the cling film that we'll be putting on shortly. I would suggest you do several of these. Some of them you will like more than others, but I can guarantee that you will get some very interesting Christmas cards out of them. I placed the cling film on and just pressed it down in a few places so that the colours merged and so that the leaves got those nice sort of abstracty patterns on them from the cling film. You do have to be very patient and let the painting underneath the cling film dry completely, which is another reason for working on more than one of these at once. And then remove the masking fluid. You can use a rubber or your finger to do this, just from where the berries are. And then the next stage will be painting the berries themselves. I'm painting the holly berries in exactly the same way as I did earlier in the video, using the mixes of cadmium orange with cadmium red and a little alizarin crimson. and then just the finishing touches on the berries. The next stage of the painting is to suggest some little branches and twigs coming off them, and to do this I used a rigger brush and a stiff mix of a nice dark brown using something like the burnt sienna and ultramarine. I painted two more of these little pictures using the same drawing and similar colour mix, as I wanted to show you some additional techniques you could use to make the painting look a little bit more Christmassy. But what I'll do first is put the three together and show you some options I had for making Christmas cards from some blank ones that I already had. Finding a pleasing composition is all part of the painting process and is very subjective sometimes. I hope you like them, and I hope you feel inspired to give it a go yourselves. But don't go away just yet, because I've got some spattering techniques to show you next. White gouache is extremely useful in watercolour painting. It's very opaque. It's a lot more opaque than watercolour white. Here I'm using it just to suggest a little bit of snow on the branches. It might be particularly useful to use this if, like me, sometimes the branches are a little bit too thick in places. You can just put a little bit of white gouache on that stands for snow. Another useful technique using the gouache is to splatter it with a toothbrush, as I'm doing here. Don't overdo it though, or you'll hide everything that you've painted. It's a little bit tricky getting the right consistency of paint, I've found. It has to be the consistency of very, very thick cream. You don't need too much water with it. If you want some bigger splatters, then you can always use a brush. There's a little bit of a knack to it, and I still struggle doing this. I think it's best to hold the brush at the end and then to tap, as I'm doing, a bit nearer the bristles. If you don't succeed that well, you can always cheat a little bit and put some very small dabs on there with the brush, but don't overdo it. And finally, quite often I will splatter with a coloured paint. In this case I'm using the dark green. I think it gives a sense of spontaneity to the painting, and maybe in this case helps with the sort of abstracty feel that I was trying to achieve. I did some of this splatter work on my original painting. I also put on a little bit of toothbrush splatter as well with the white gouache. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something from my painting demonstrations and chat. There are lots of links in the description box, and please subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss what I do next. I'm not quite sure what that's going to be, but I think it will probably be a simple snow scene for beginners.